What's up everybody, welcome back to the channel. So I've covered how to make several different space scenes on this channel, like creating black holes, gas giants, and photorealistic planets. But nebulas are an entirely different beast. They require tons of light sources and super detailed volumetrics, which is probably the most costly combination you could have in a 3D scene. This kind of sucks because nebulas are often the backbone of sci-fi backgrounds, from small indie art to major media productions. But in this tutorial, I'm going to show you a creative way to render awesome scenes like these in seconds and 360-degree HDRIs for your 3D work. So now with all that said, let's jump into the tutorial. Now I know all my tutorials up till now have been about using Blender, and we are going to use Blender later. But one of the secret tricks we're going to use for this method is we're going to use a software called IFS Renderer. It is totally free, it's open source, and you can find it at the link in the description, or you can just go to ifsrenderer.z97.io, click download. There are some compatibility requirements, but pretty much anything you're running should be capable of running this. Now, while that's being downloaded, you'll also want to download this free gradient pack from Tetrachroma on DeviantArt. Again, that link is in the description. We're using the Meteoric pack. You can download that here. And this is what we'll be using to actually color our nebulas, at least initially. Now, once you've got IFS installed, just like you would any other program, you can just come down here, search it up, and we're going to open a new project file. So just before we start, one thing I want to point out is that IFS is actually a fractal rendering system, and so it essentially generates giant point clouds and combines fractals to create visualizations. And one really cool way to experience this is to just click this random button up here that the creator of this program actually made, and this will just generate a totally random combination of fractals for you to look at. Most of these are not visually very pleasing, but it's an easy way to sort of get a feel for what this software can do outside of just what we're doing in this tutorial. It's super versatile, and I highly recommend exploring its capabilities. So now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to sort of set up our render settings. So if you look over here, you have two tabs labeled Exploration and Final, and you can sort of think of these as like your viewport and render resolution that you'd have in Blender. So let's hop over to Final, and you can see this here is set to HD 1920 by 1080, and if I hit lock aspect ratio, I can then come in and just double this to 2160, and now I'll be rendering 4K. If you're on a really slow machine, you might want to leave this at HD, at least for now, just so that it's easier to play around with when we come back. Now if we come down here, you can see we have this thing labeled Target Iteration Level. This is sort of like your number of samples that you would have in Blender. The only difference is that in IFS, this is just an arbitrary point where you stop. You can export really at any point. And so 15 is honestly fine for anything that we're doing, but sometimes you might want to raise it up to 20. And if you're getting really deep into something, or if you notice some weird glitches, just consider sliding that over. Now, of course, we also have this option for noise reduction. If you notice a lot of noise, just click it on. The default settings are totally fine. I'm just going to leave it off for now, though. Now, these two settings are really important, your syntropy and your warm-up. These will sort of affect the actual appearance of your scene. And so I'm going to set my syntropy to 700, and I'm going to set my warm-up to 200. There's really no reason to have to change these. Again, I encourage you to play around with them, but honestly, I've never had to deviate from these settings. Now I'm just going to go ahead and save my file. Now I'm just going to go ahead and, good practice, save my file. And some basic controls. So I really like to control this brightness. You really have to for the work that we're doing here. This will just make your scene more intense. There is this gamma value, which you can use to great effect to alter how the scene actually looks. I actually usually set this a lot lower than the default. You've also got this fog effect, which is sort of just compositing a depth mask onto your scene actively. And then you've got this field of view, which is just the degrees that you can actually see. It's a bit unintuitive at first, but easy to catch on with. And if you want to move around, it's just left click to sort of point your viewing angle, and then it's just WASD to move around. If you scroll down, you will then move a little bit slower. If you scroll forward, you will move a lot faster. If you want to roll your camera, it's just the U and the O keys. And so it's a bit difficult to learn the navigation, especially if you're just used to using Blender, but I found that you get used to it decently quickly. Another cool option I just want to let you know about, even though we won't use it here, is that you can set the aperture. So if you set this very large, for example, and then you adjust your focus distance, you can get that awesome looking depth of field. This honestly is something I want to experiment with a lot more for any sort of like quantum scale renders, anything sort of abstract like that. But for now, we are going to just turn this off because nebulas, of course, there is no depth of field because of how massive and far away they are. I'm also going to click back to exploration over here on my settings. This will just have me render at a lower resolution for now and keep things a little bit faster. Now, to actually create our nebula, we're going to come up here and we're going to click on the editor. So you can see we have sort of our randomly generated combination. And it's a little bit difficult to work with, but in the software's defense, it was literally built by like one guy as part of his thesis project. So it's pretty awesome that we just get this thing even as is. Now I'm going to come in and I'm actually just going to delete all of these. There we go. And now I'm going to build a very basic structure. So IFS works on the concept of loops because that way it can iterate through the loop to sort of generate all the detail we see. So you can see if I just put in a fine fractal in, which we're going to use at the moment, then I don't get anything. But if I combine this with a spherical, now we've actually got something occurring, though it doesn't look very visually appealing. If you want to get rid of a single connection, you're just going to want to click on this line and set the weight to 0. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add another spherical, and I'm going to add another affine. And we're just going to build this out sort of into a square. For these guys, I'm going to connect them like that. Connect these guys as so. And let's get rid of this here. Now, we still don't really have anything cool looking, so that's unfortunate. But if we just turn off all but this original affine, and then we come in here, and I'm just going to use some values I already know so that we can get some nice looking results. And we're just going to play with our translation and our rotation. Then we're going to come down here to our other affine, and we're going to play with this as well. And you can see we're getting something over here, so we can fly over. I'll adjust my scale for this one as well, and rotate it. Then I'm going to come over to my sphericals, and I'm going to set the offset to just something different. Do something like that, and something like this. And you can see now we clearly have some sort of fractal getting rendered. It's actually visually pleasing to look at now, finally. And I'm going to adjust my brightness just a bit. Let's go and let's lower this radius still. Something like a 0.17. And unfortunately, it doesn't normalize the image for you. So if you get further out, there's just going to be more light and you kind of have to manually adjust your brightness. But it's not too difficult to worry about. The other thing you can do is that if you come up here to the base weight values, you can adjust these and you can see how that affects the fractal. I'm going to raise the impact of both of these just a little bit. Now, another thing you can do, and I'm going to do that with this refine here, is that you can connect them to themselves. And this gives us a whole nother layer of distortion. And so I think now you can see much more clearly how this can look like a nebula. And so if I adjust my field of view and then adjust my brightness, you can see how we're starting to get that sort of nebula look. Now, the next thing I want to do before I add more detail to my nebula is I want to add stars, because there's a really, really cool way to add them in here. There's actually multiple ways, but this is the one that I prefer, which is that we're going to click on this and add a Gaussian blur. Then we're going to set our base weight to a 0.005. And we're going to adjust our radius to a 0.0001. And now you can see we have added our stars. They vary in, of course, size and deformation. I really like how this kind of looks. It looks like it's got volumetric interaction. And you can see that even with just this incredibly simple setup, we've already got a pretty cool looking scene. And now, one thing I do want to point out at this point, and this is sort of a downside to using this method, is that unlike with Blender noise textures, there's no random seed value for any of these. You can't just like slide a W slider or adjust the coordinates or anything. So unfortunately, you kind of just have to manually adjust these translations in order to get different looks, which will actually affect the overall look of your scene. Though, one thing I'll also point out is if you just decrease your field of view so that you're zoomed in pretty far, up your brightness like crazy, you don't have to be quite that zoomed in, but something like that, you can just pan and look at different parts of the screen, and it's essentially like you're generating different nebulas. And then on top of that, of course, you can just move around, because this is, in reality, just a 3D point cloud. And so that really is the best way I found, especially if you find a structure that you like. Like, I really like the way this looks right here. That looks awesome to me. And so if you find something, you can just zoom in and sort of move around it to create the effect of creating a new nebula. Now, the next thing. So we added those random nebulas before, and it generated a random color map for us here. But, you know, I'm looking at this. The red looks kind of cool. I could totally see that as a stylistic choice, but maybe I want a different color, or maybe I want, you know, some variation in how it actually looks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click this button up here while I've got this visible affine selected. And I'm going to go to wherever I put that gradient file that we downloaded. I'm going to double click on this. And now I can go through and I can just select whatever I like. So I think I'm going to go with this fire in the sky. I like stuff that has very bright colors and not a lot of dark colors. Because, you know, in real life, it's essentially the same as everything being emissive. You don't really emit a dark purple. And so an easy way to get some realism is to just try to use those more intense colors. But now I can just slide this, or I can just manually drag the color index, and that will alter just the color off of the gradient that it picks. But I can also adjust this color speed, which will adjust how much it changes as it goes deeper into the fractal. And so you can get some really nice combinations this way. I do like to keep them relatively two-toned and not try to add too much visual detail this way, or not to rely on it at least. But by sliding these, you can get some really awesome color palettes. It's really fun just to play around with this. I might punch up the brightness here, and I can shrink this down, and just like before, it wasn't really quite as visible, but you can use this sort of fog effect to give that nice sort of depth compositing sort of look. It's a nice option to have, and I think for certain scenes especially, it can be a good way to either add randomness or just to give the effect that you're looking for. Remember also you can adjust your gamma, and so I usually have this set pretty low, just because I like that sort of punchy contrast. And honestly, I'm quite happy with this scene. And so I'm going to come into this editor, and before we render out a final image from IFS, I want to show you guys, just make sure that you play around with these, because if I add, say, a Julia Nix, look at that. I get that sort of wavy sort of look, and I can adjust this weight. And that gives this really nice, almost stylized, like Marvel background that I really like. I know it's not perfectly photorealistic or anything, but honestly, at a certain point, you can just go for stylized. And it's just a lot of fun to kind of play around with the different options that this software provides. So with that more or less completed, I'm going to go ahead and find a sort of an angle that I really like. Might just look around here in case there's anything I missed, which of course you can see there's a whole bunch of cool looking shots, but I'm going to keep this one. I might go ahead and try to shrink down my stars just a little bit. Again, turn this 1:2805 here. That'll do the trick. And now with that done, we can click over to our final. And that is something you want to remember to do. I have on many occasions left it on exploration before I export, and then had to sit and look as my low resolution image that was super beautiful is just terrible the moment you zoom in. And now the thing you can do is we can pretty much just sit here and wait as long as we like. It'll just keep doing more iterations. I might try turning on the noise reduction here. This kind of smooths out my image a lot more than I would like it to though. So I'm going to uncheck this. Down here you can see the progress in getting to the target iteration level. Right now this is sitting at 19, and honestly I think that is enough. So I'm just going to show you guys to export. We just come and click export. And at least for the sake of this tutorial, you can normally export to PNG if you think this is good enough for you, but I'm going to export to EXR. And so I'm just going to save my image, and that will just take a split second. And now the Blender portion of the tutorial begins. So I'm just going to open up a new Blender file, and I'm going to hop over to the compositing workspace. We're actually just going to be using Blender as a compositor for this case. I will switch over to cycles and GPU compute. I have no idea if this actually improves anything, but it honestly just feels weird to have any other settings at this point. Now, before we do anything, I'm actually going to adjust my performance settings. So I'm going to set my edit to low quality, and you're going to want to check this OpenCL box. This honestly should be turned on by default. I don't know why Blender has it off. It just enables you to use your GPU for some nodes for the compositor. Super awesome, speeds things up. I always make sure to use that. You can also turn on buffer groups. This helps a little bit, not as much, but it's pretty decent. And with that, we can go ahead and grab an image node, navigate to wherever you stored your file, and shift right click to add in a joint. Let's add in a viewer node, and I'm just going to check the snap to grid option. Now we actually have to render something in order for Blender to recognize our scene. And so I'm just going to go check render image. Something will render very, very quickly. And there we go. Now if we disconnect our image and plug it back in, now if you look at your image, you're going to see there's really nothing here. You can see that little speck, but it seems like we almost don't have an image. With IFS and saving to EXR, it just gets rid of all that brightness that we added, all those gamma adjustments. And so we're going to have to add those back in manually. And the nice thing though, is that we'll have a lot more data to work with. So if we were working with PNG, we'd just be totally locked in. But since we're not, we can actually work with this image a lot more. So I'm going to adjust my gamma. Let's do something like a 1.5, 1.6. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, I don't like that transparency. It makes it kind of hard to edit. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to Shift A, and I'm going to add in a lens distortion node because that gets rid of our alpha. Just a quick and easy way to do that. And you can always come down here and adjust the exposure and gamma as well, by the way. The benefit of using this versus the nodes is that editing these will cause it to recalculate everything. Editing these, it just applies it to the overall image, nice and easy. The next thing I want to do is if I zoom in here, you can see I've still got some of this noise. So I'm just going to Shift A, and I'm going to grab a blur node, switch it to fast Gaussian, and let's just give it 1 pixel of blur in each direction. And then we can actually add in a denoise node before then. This does make our image a lot more sort of smudged. And if you come down here, if you open that composite view, you'll see it's still displaying a HD image because I upscaled to 4K. We're going to need a 4K render area, so just boost that to 200% if that's what you're doing. Render out another image. It'll take like 4 seconds. And there we go. So I quite like this, but I want to add a little bit of sort of bloom. So the quick and easy way to do this, and for the time being, I'm going to remove this denoise node, just because it's a bit intensive to have that node there. Let's grab another blur node and a mix node. Plug this guy in here, leave this as Gaussian, plug that in there. Set this to add, and then just blur the image a whole bunch. There we go. And we can just adjust this factor as we like. That seems pretty nice. I'll also grab a brightness contrast node, toss this in earlier. Let's maybe up our contrast a bit. And you'll have to uncheck this convert pre-multiplied, by the way. Maybe go a little bit lower. There we go. And now one last thing we can do is just add a hue saturation value node. And I just like to play around with this. You can usually get pretty cool results from doing stuff like this. Like you get that really nice ice blue mixed with purple. I think that's pretty cool. And that pretty much concludes the compositing effect. Now, one thing when I look at this particular one, it's a bit sort of smooth, almost sort of glass-like, rather than the nebula look I want. So I'm just going to hop back here, hop back to my editor, and let's just add in a little something more. Let's add in another affine maybe. We'll shrink down our workspace. Now I've just sort of fidgeted around with those settings, and let's find another shot to line up. And I kind of like the look of that. Hop over to final mode, and I'm just going to let this render out. And yeah, that's the result. Now, one last thing I told you guys I was going to do, and I highly, highly recommend using this. If we come back to exploration mode, we can switch down here from projection perspective to equirectangular. And now we are seeing a 360-degree equirectangular map of the actual scene. And so it's obviously very weird to move around, but if we switch over to our final, you'll want to unlink these and set your resolution to an even rectangle. And now there is one thing you have to know on the Blender side of this though. There is sort of a vertical compression that happens with the 360 image. So when you bring it into your world, you can just bring it in like you would a regular environment texture. But once you are in here, you're going to have to click on this, press Ctrl-T, and that'll bring up the mapping node. Just set your Z to 0.5, and it's going to take a second to update the lights. And yeah, that's the tutorial, y'all. But now before you go, one thing I do want to shout out is I've actually been working with a really cool team of people on a game called Flagship Frenzy. The social media page recently just went live. If you guys want to follow the development, it's on Instagram at Flagship Frenzy. And it's a pretty cool way to see how Blender and these more open source tools are being used in actual professional game development, and how you might be able to use these tools to either further your artistic endeavors, whether they be just as a hobbyist or as a career. As always, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, consider liking, subscribing, all that YouTube jazz, and I'll see you all in the next video.